The howling wind carries death across the ancient plains. Sand cuts through flesh like obsidian blades as the sky turns black with fury. In the suffocating darkness, desperate screams echo from beneath tons of sand and stone. A father claws at the earth with bleeding fingers, knowing that somewhere below, his children are running out of air. Time is his enemy, and the merciless desert has already claimed too many lives. But some bonds are stronger than death itself. This is the story of one man's descent into hell to rescue what matters most, a tale from 6.4 million years ago, when survival meant everything, and love could drive someone beyond the edge of human endurance. Tonight, we witness the moment that defined what it truly means to be human. She was a female Homo habilis named Kira, her weathered hands still trembling from the morning hunt when the first whispers of wind began to dance across the savanna. The acacia trees swayed ominously against the copper-colored horizon, their thorny branches scratching at the darkening sky like skeletal fingers. Kira crouched beside the flickering embers of their communal fire, her keen eyes scanning the landscape that had been home to her tribe for countless seasons. The smell of roasted antelope meat still lingered in the air, mixed with the earthy scent of dried grass and the faint musk of the nearby watering hole. Her two children, Nuru and little Django, played nearby with sharpened sticks, their innocent laughter cutting through the growing tension that seemed to press down on the settlement like an invisible weight. "Mama, look," Nuru called out, pointing his primitive spear toward the distant mountains. "The sky is eating the sun." Kira's blood ran cold as she followed her son's gaze. A massive wall of sand rose from the desert floor, towering hundreds of feet into the air like the wrath of some ancient god. The approaching storm moved with terrifying speed, devouring everything in its path. She had seen sandstorms before, but nothing like this monstrosity that seemed to stretch from horizon to horizon. The wind began to howl with increasing intensity, carrying with it the acrid taste of distant death and the promise of destruction. Other members of their small band were already shouting warnings, scrambling to secure their meager possessions and seek shelter in the shallow caves that dotted the rocky outcropping, where they had made their temporary home. "Into the caves, now!" Kira's voice cracked with urgency as she grabbed both children, her calloused hands rough against their sun-darkened skin. The storm was moving faster than anything natural should move, as if driven by some malevolent force that hungered for their destruction. Nuru, barely 8 seasons old, but already showing the survival instincts that would either save or doom him, helped guide his younger brother toward the largest cave entrance. Little Django, only 5 seasons and still clinging to the innocence that their harsh world would soon strip away, stumbled on the loose rocks, his small cry lost in the growing roar of the approaching tempest. The other families were running now, their faces masks of primal terror as they abandoned tools, food, and anything that might slow their desperate flight to safety. Old Moto, the tribe's eldest member and keeper of their ancestral knowledge, moved as fast as his ancient legs could carry him, but Kira could see he wouldn't make it to the caves in time. The first wave of sand hit them like a physical blow, stinging their exposed skin and filling their mouths with the taste of grit and fear. Visibility dropped to mere arm's length, as the world around them disappeared into a swirling vortex of brown and gold. The wind screamed with the voices of 1,000 demons, drowning out their desperate calls to each other. Kira pushed her children toward what she hoped was the cave entrance, her hands outstretched, feeling blindly through the chaos. The sand was everywhere now, in their eyes, their lungs, their very souls. She could hear Django crying somewhere to her left, but the sound seemed to come from every direction at once. "Mama, I can't see." Noru's voice was barely audible above the storm's fury. And then, with a sound like the earth itself cracking open, something massive gave way above them. The rockfall came without warning, a cascade of stone and sand that transformed their refuge into a tomb in mere seconds. Kira felt the ground shake beneath her feet as tons of debris crashed down from the cliff face above, triggered by the storm's relentless assault on the weakened limestone formations. She threw herself forward, her body acting on pure maternal instinct, trying to shield her children from the avalanche of death raining down around them. The last thing she saw before the world went black was Django's terrified face, his small mouth open in a scream that was instantly swallowed by the thunderous roar of collapsing stone. When consciousness returned, Kira found herself trapped in absolute darkness, her body wedged between two massive boulders that had somehow formed a small air pocket around her. Every breath was a struggle, the air thick with dust and the metallic taste of blood. Her left arm hung useless at her side, likely broken, and she could feel warm liquid trickling down her forehead. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the anguish that tore through her heart like a spear of ice. Her children were somewhere in this hellish maze of rubble, possibly hurt, possibly dying, possibly already dead. The thought drove her beyond the edge of rational thought and into a realm of pure, desperate determination. Nuru, Django. Her voice came out as little more than a rasp, but she kept calling, pressing her ear against the cold stone, listening for any sound that might indicate her sons were still alive. Minutes passed like hours. The storm still raged outside, but here in the bowels of the earth, a different kind of hell had taken hold. Kira began to claw at the rocks with her good hand, her fingernails breaking against the unyielding stone, blood mixing with sand as she fought to create a passage through the debris. Then she heard it, a faint tapping, rhythmic and desperate. Someone was alive down there, trapped but conscious enough to signal. The sound was coming from somewhere below and to her right, deeper in the collapsed section where the cave's main chamber had been. "I'm coming," she shouted into the darkness, though she had no idea if her voice could penetrate the layers of rock and sand between them. "Hold on." Using her good arm and her legs, Kira began the agonizing process of squeezing through gaps between the fallen stones. Each movement sent waves of pain through her injured body, but she pushed forward, driven by a love that transcended physical limitations. The tapping continued, sometimes strong, sometimes so faint she wondered if she was imagining it. The air grew thinner as she descended deeper into the rubble pile. Her lungs burned with each breath, and she could feel panic trying to claw its way up her throat. This was madness. She might die down here, and then who would save her children? But turning back was not an option. It had never been an option. As she forced herself through a particularly narrow gap, her exploring hand touched something soft and warm. Fabric. Human skin. One of her children was here, wedged in a space so small that only a child could have survived in it. "Django?" she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. A weak whimper answered her, the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. But as her hands explored further, she realized with growing horror that her youngest son was pinned beneath a boulder that would require the strength of several adults to move. And somewhere in the darkness beyond, she could still hear that desperate tapping, which meant Nuru was alive too, but equally trapped in this underground labyrinth of death. The storm outside continued its relentless assault, and Kira realized with crystal clarity that she was facing an impossible choice that would haunt her for whatever remained of her life. Django's small body was wedged beneath a slab of limestone that had fallen at an angle, creating a space just large enough to keep him from being crushed instantly. But the weight was slowly pressing down, and Kira could see in the dim light filtering through cracks in the rubble that her youngest child was struggling to breathe. His eyes, wide with terror and confusion, found hers in the darkness. "Mama, it hurts," he whispered, his voice so small and broken that it tore something fundamental loose in Kira's chest. "I know, little warrior. I know." She forced her voice to remain calm even as her world collapsed around her. "Mom is going to get you out of here." But even as she spoke the words, She could hear Nuru's tapping, growing weaker from somewhere deeper in the collapsed cave system. Time was running out for both her children, and she was just one person with one working arm, trapped in a tomb of stone and sand. Kira pressed her face close to Django's, breathing in the familiar scent of her child, sun-warmed skin mixed with the dust of their daily adventures. "Listen to me very carefully," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm going to try to move this stone, but first I need to check on your brother. Can you be brave for me?" Django nodded weakly, though she could see the fear in his eyes intensifying at the thought of being left alone again. "Don't leave me, Mama." The words hit her like physical blows. How could she explain to a 5-year-old that sometimes love means making impossible choices? That sometimes being a mother means walking into hell itself, not knowing if you'll emerge with one child, both children, or neither. "I will never leave you," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "Even if I have to tear this mountain apart stone by stone." She kissed his forehead, tasting salt and sand, then began the nightmarish journey deeper into the rubble. The tapping had stopped, and that silence was more terrifying than any storm. Kira called out as she crawled through spaces that seemed designed to trap and kill, her broken arms screaming with each movement. "Nuru, answer me." Nothing. The passage grew narrower as she descended, forcing her to exhale completely, just to squeeze through gaps barely wider than her shoulders. The weight of countless tons of stone pressed down above her, and she could hear the mountain settling with ominous creaks and groans. One shift, one small tremor, and this entire section could collapse completely. Then, through a crack no wider than her fist, she heard breathing, shallow, labored, but unmistakably alive. "Nuru! Mama!" The response was so faint she almost missed it. I can't move my legs." Kira's heart plummeted into some dark abyss within her chest. She pressed her face against the opening, trying to see through to where her eldest son was trapped. In the dim light, she could make out his face, pale and streaked with tears, but alive. Gloriously, impossibly alive. But the space he was trapped in was even smaller than Django's prison, and between them lay several tons of debris that would take days to clear, even with proper tools and help. Days they didn't have. "Can you move your arms?" she asked. "Yes," came the weak reply. "Then keep tapping. Every few minutes, tap against the stone so I know you're still with me. I'm going to get help." But even as she said it, Kira knew there was no help coming. The storm still raged outside, and the other members of their tribe, if any had survived, would assume everyone in the caves was already dead. She was on her own, with 2 dying children and rapidly dwindling time. As she began the agonizing crawl back to where Django waited, Kira made a decision that would define the rest of her existence. She would not choose between her children. She would save them both or die trying. The alternative was simply not acceptable to a mother's heart. Kira emerged from the deeper passages covered in blood and stone dust, her body pushed beyond its limits but her resolve burning brighter than ever. Django's eyes tracked her movement as she returned to his side, hope flickering in those young features despite the crushing weight that held him prisoner. "I found him," she whispered, trying to force confidence into her voice. "Nuru's alive. Now we just have to get both of you out of here." But the logistics of the situation were nightmarish. The boulder pinning Django weighed more than several adults combined, and moving it would require leverage she didn't possess. Meanwhile, reaching Nuru meant clearing a path through debris that had taken the mountain itself to create. Kira examined the fallen slab more carefully, running her hands along its edges, searching for any weakness or angle she could exploit. The stone was wedged against another boulder, creating the precarious balance that had saved Django's life but now imprisoned him. If she could shift the weight distribution somehow, ... "Mama, I'm scared," Django whispered, his small voice cutting through her desperate calculations. She looked down at her youngest son, this brave little soul who had never known a world without danger, who had learned to sleep with the sounds of hyenas calling in the distance, and had played with rocks that could be shaped into tools for killing. Even in their harsh existence, he had maintained an innocence that seemed impossible in their brutal world. "Do you remember the story of the great mammoth?" Kira asked, settling beside him as much as the confining space would allow. "The one that your grandfather used to tell?" Django nodded weakly. The tale was one of their tribe's most cherished stories of a legendary hunter who had faced a massive mammoth with nothing but determination and cleverness, eventually bringing down the giant beast to save his starving family. That hunter was smaller than the mammoth, just like we are smaller than this stone. But he won because he never gave up. He found the mammoth's weakness and used it against the beast. Kira began working as she spoke, examining every inch of the boulder's surface. "Every mountain has a weakness, little warrior. We just have to be smart enough to find it." From the deeper passages, she could hear Nuru's tapping, weaker now but still regular. Still alive. The sound gave her strength, even as it added urgency to her desperate efforts. Then she found it, a crack in the boulder, so small she had almost missed it in the dim light. Water had seeped into the limestone over countless seasons, freezing and thawing, gradually weakening the stone's internal structure. The crack ran deep, and if she could wedge something into it, Kira pulled off one of her leather foot coverings and examined the bone tools secured to her belt. The pointed awl her mate had crafted for her seasons ago was strong and sharp, designed for piercing hides, but it might serve another purpose today. "What are you doing, Mama?" "Fighting a mountain," she replied, positioning the awl at the narrowest point of the crack. "And mountains, my brave son, are not as strong as they pretend to be." She began to work the tool into the fissure, using a stone as a hammer to drive it deeper. Each strike sent vibrations through the boulder, and she held her breath, hoping she wasn't about to bring more debris crashing down on them. The confined space filled with the sharp crack of metal against stone, a rhythm that seemed to echo Nuru's desperate tapping from below. Minutes passed. Her good arm ached with the repetitive motion, and the broken one throbbed with each jarring impact. But slowly, impossibly, the crack began to widen. The ancient limestone, weakened by eons of patient water, started to surrender to her desperate assault. A piece of stone the size of her fist broke away. Then another. The boulder shuddered slightly, its weight shifting as its structural integrity began to fail. "Mama!" Django's voice carried a note of excitement for the first time since the collapse. "It's moving." But Kira knew they weren't safe yet. The boulder's collapse could go in any direction, and if it fell wrong, it could crush Django instead of freeing him. She needed to control the direction of the break, to guide the stone's death throes in a way that would save rather than destroy. From deep in the passage, Nuru's tapping had stopped again. Time was running out, and the mountain still held both her children in its deadly embrace. The silence from Nuru's direction hit Kira like a physical blow, but she couldn't afford to lose focus now. The boulder above Django had begun to shift, hairline fractures spreading like spider webs across its surface. She had perhaps minutes before the entire structure either collapsed safely or crushed her youngest son. "Django, listen to me very carefully," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos of emotions raging in her chest. "When I tell you to, you're going to push yourself as far to your left as you can. Do you understand?" The child nodded, his small face set in a mask of concentration that broke Kira's heart. No child should have to be this brave, she thought. But their world demanded courage from everyone, regardless of age. Kira positioned herself at the crack she had been widening, using her body weight to apply pressure to the weakened stone. The boulder groaned ominously, and dust showered down from the ceiling of their small air pocket. Each second stretched into eternity as she calculated angles and forces, drawing on knowledge passed down through generations of survivors. "Now, Django, move now." The boy pushed himself sideways, just as Kira threw all her weight against the stone tool. The crack widened with a sound like thunder, and the boulder split along its fault line. The upper portion, suddenly freed from the structural support of its lower half, toppled away from them, crashing into the passage behind with an impact that shook the entire debris field. Django cried out, not in pain, but in joy and relief as the crushing weight lifted from his small body. Kira pulled him into her arms, feeling for injuries, checking that his limbs moved properly. Miraculously, aside from bruises and cuts, he seemed intact. "Can you walk?" she asked urgently. "I think so," Django replied, testing his legs. "Mama, what about Nuru?" That question cut straight to the core of her terror. The silence from the deeper passages had stretched on too long, but she had to believe her eldest son was still alive. The alternative was unthinkable. "We're going to get him now," she said with more confidence than she felt. "Both of us together." They made their way through the labyrinth of fallen stone, Django following close behind his mother, his small hands gripping the back of her garment. The passage that had seemed impossible to navigate with an injured arm became merely difficult with her youngest son's help. His small size allowed him to scout ahead through gaps too narrow for her, and his keen eye spotted handholds and footholds that she had missed in her earlier desperate passage. "There!" Django pointed to a crack in the rubble wall. "I can hear something." Kira pressed her ear to the opening and held her breath. There, so faint it might have been imagination, was the sound of labored breathing. "Nuru!" she called. "Nuru, answer me!" A weak voice drifted through the stone. "Mama ... I can't. Can't stay awake ... quotes." The words sent ice through Kira's veins. Nuru was suffocating, his air supply nearly exhausted. They had minutes at most before they lost him forever, but now she had help. Django might be small, but he was also clever and determined. Together, they began the frantic process of widening the crack, using every tool and technique at their disposal. Kira hammered at weak points in the stone, while Django cleared away the debris, their combined efforts accomplishing in minutes what would have taken her much longer alone. The opening grew larger. Soon it was wide enough for Django to squeeze through. "I can see him," the boy called back. "He's trapped under rocks, but he's moving." "Can you reach him?" "I think so." What followed was the most terrifying collaboration of Kira's life, as she guided her 5-year-old son through the process of carefully removing stones from around his older brother. Each piece of debris had to be assessed. Would removing it cause other rocks to shift and fall? Was it supporting something crucial to the structure of their makeshift cave? Slowly, painfully, they created a space large enough for Nuru to crawl through. When he finally emerged into their small refuge, his face was gray with exhaustion, and his legs were scraped and bleeding, but he was alive. For a moment, the three of them simply held each other in the darkness, a family reunited against impossible odds. But their celebration was cut short by a new sound from above, the groan of shifting stone as the storm continued to batter the mountain's peak. Their small sanctuary was about to become their tomb unless they found a way to reach the surface immediately. The mountain above them was dying, its ancient bones cracking under the relentless assault of the sandstorm. Kira could hear the deep groans of shifting stone, feel the vibrations of massive sections of cliff face tearing away and crashing down into the passages below. Their small air pocket, which had seemed like salvation mere minutes ago, now felt like the bottom of a grave that was slowly filling in. "We have to climb," Kira announced, though the words felt like madness even as she spoke them. Above them, through cracks in the debris ceiling, she could see hints of gray light, not the healthy light of day, but the filtered illumination of the storm's fury. It meant there was a way up, a path through the rubble to the surface. "I can't feel my legs properly," Nuru admitted. his voice barely audible. The hours trapped beneath the stone had taken their toll, and Kira could see that her eldest son was struggling to maintain consciousness. "Then we carry each other," she replied simply. "That's what families do." What followed was an ascent that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. Using techniques passed down by generations of cave-dwelling ancestors, Kira created a human chain with her sons. Django, the smallest and most agile, scouted ahead, finding handholds and stable platforms in the chaotic jumble of fallen stone. Nuru, despite his injuries, provided a steady anchor point, using his upper body strength to support the others when the climbing became treacherous. And Kira, with her one good arm and maternal desperation, served as the driving force that kept them all moving upward when logic screamed that they should give up. The air grew thicker with dust and sand as they climbed. The storm's fury reached down through every crack and crevice, trying to drag them back into the depths. Several times, sections of their climbing route shifted or collapsed, forcing them to backtrack and find new paths through the three-dimensional maze of rubble. "I can see sky," Django called out when they were perhaps halfway to the surface. "Real sky." The announcement gave them all renewed strength, but it also revealed the magnitude of their final challenge. The opening Django had spotted was barely large enough for a child to squeeze through, and it was still several body lengths above them through some of the most unstable-looking debris they had yet encountered. Kira made another impossible decision. "Django goes first," she announced. "He's small enough to get through easily, and if the passage collapses, at least one of us will be safe." "No." Both boys protested simultaneously. "We stay together." "Listen to me," Kira said, her voice carrying the authority of a mother who had led them this far and would not be argued with now. "Django goes first and finds help. If there are other survivors up there, we'll need them to help get Nuru through. This isn't abandonment, it's strategy." The logic was sound, even if the emotional cost was devastating. Django's face crumpled with the understanding that he might be seeing his family for the last time, but he nodded bravely and began the final ascent. What followed were the longest minutes of Kira's existence. She could hear her youngest son struggling through the narrow passage above, could hear rocks shifting and falling back into the depths. Then, suddenly, blessed silence. "Mama!" Django's voice came from what seemed like an impossible distance. "I made it. And there are people up here. They're coming to help." The rescue that followed was a blur of hands reaching down through the debris, ropes improvised from animal hides, and voices calling out encouragement in the darkness. Other members of their tribe, led by old Moto, who had somehow survived the initial collapse, worked with desperate efficiency to widen the passage and extract the trapped family. When Kira finally emerged into the storm-lashed world above, she found the landscape transformed. The sandstorm was beginning to weaken, its fury spent after hours of devastating assault. But where their settlement had once stood, only scattered debris remained. Most of their possessions were gone, buried under tons of sand and stone. Yet, as she looked around at the faces of the survivors, battered, exhausted, but alive, Kira realized that everything truly important had been saved. Her children breathed beside her, injured but whole. Her tribe, though reduced in number, endured. Old Moto approached her as she sat in the weakening wind, her sons pressed close against her sides. His ancient eyes held a mixture of respect and something deeper, recognition of a feat that would become legend among their people. "You went into the mountain's belly and brought back life," he said simply. "Your story will be told around fires until the last star falls from the sky." But Kira barely heard him. She was listening to her children's breathing, feeling their heartbeats against her own battered body, and marveling at the simple miracle of their survival. They had faced the mountain's fury and emerged victorious, not through strength or cunning alone, but through the unbreakable bonds that tie a family together. As the storm finally began to clear, and the first tentative rays of sunlight broke through the dissipating clouds. Kira allowed herself a moment of profound gratitude. They were alive. They were together. And in a world where survival was never guaranteed, that was everything. The sandstorm had tried to claim them, had buried their home and scattered their possessions to the four winds. But it had failed in its ultimate purpose. For in the end, the love between a mother and her children had proven stronger than any force nature could unleash, more enduring than stone, and more powerful than death itself. In the distance, new storm clouds were already gathering on the horizon, promising fresh challenges and unknown dangers. But Kira faced them without fear. She had already conquered the impossible once. She could do it again.